The Nintendo 64, a system that came late to the 5th generation of home consoles, to eventually face off against the Sega Saturn and Sony PlayStation. The 64, which began its life as Project Reality, was Nintendo's attempt to regain control of the console market. Nintendo had sat out for the first 2 years of the 32-bit wars in favor of waiting for more affordable technology, sticking with the Super Nintendo as long as possible. The affordable technology that made the 64 possible was the Reality coprocessor, developed by Silicon Graphics, which ironically was offered to Sega's Tom Kalinske prior to Nintendo using it in their system. The Nintendo 64 is a notable system because it was the most powerful home console released of that generation, but it was also the last major console to use cartridges for game distribution. Sega and Sony both opted to use CD-based systems, allowing for cheaper production and shorter lead times on game manufacturing. Nintendo 64 was also the first flagship console Nintendo released that didn't capture the majority of the Japanese home market. The system actually did worse than the Sega Saturn in its home country. The Nintendo 64 fared much better in the United States when it surpassed the Saturn, and for a time was making great strides against the PlayStation. The Nintendo 64 had a number of factors against it that somewhat derailed the system's momentum. It by no way was a failure, but the Nintendo, a company that had basically dominated 90% of the North American market in the decade prior, the system was somewhat of a disappointment. The 64 had a few factors against it. Namely, the system still used cartridges. Although hard for a child to damage and easy for them to use, they proved expensive and ultimately limited the size of games on the console. This ultimately limited the release of RPGs like Final Fantasy VII because of the smaller memory capability. JRPGs were very popular among that generation, and the choice of cartridges made it very difficult to create games in such limited space. The choice in cartridges were seen by third-party developers as a way for Nintendo to keep a large cut of game sales, because Nintendo controlled the manufacturing base, which had always been a staple of their profits since the early 1980s. Nintendo throughout their storied history has always favored control over distribution, control over retailers, and control over game developers. The use of cartridges facilitated that endeavor for Nintendo, so they weren't likely to change anytime soon. So Nintendo's new system had some points against it right out of the gate, with the frustration of third-party developers mixed with the system only launching with 2 titles, Mario 64 and Pilot Wings, which ultimately slowed their progress in North America. The 64 did, however, make that up and gain speed later, but it was somewhat of a misstep for Nintendo, with only 15 titles released in the first year, and 5 of those being Japanese exclusives. The PlayStation and Saturn had already been on the market for a longer period of time, and Nintendo's tardiness in that aspect gave Sony time to establish a serious foothold that the 64 couldn't unseat. Ultimately, the Nintendo 64 was an outstanding system that introduced the most popular Nintendo franchises to 3D gaming, and it did so in such a way that those games are still regarded with high acclaim. Many of those titles continue to get releases with every respective Nintendo console. The 64 offered some of the best first-party games Nintendo has ever created. It brought about new franchises like Smash Bros. And reinvented many Nintendo classics for newer generations of gamers. Nintendo 64 was a pivotal system during the formative years of many gamers, which has both made it endeared to many of them and given the system a mainstream appeal that will probably never really fade away, with its respective library of games continuing to be re-released.